Tonight, we are going to talk about something that is happening to you right now, at this very moment. You are being watched. Not by me, of course, and perhaps not by any single person you could name, but somewhere, in data centers humming quietly in the darkness, algorithms are recording what you clicked on to reach this video, how long you stayed, whether you paused, whether you scrolled. Your phone resting nearby knows where you are. The network of devices surrounding you carries faint traces of your existence into invisible architectures of observation that stretch around the globe. And here is what makes this truly remarkable. You knew all of this already, did you not? Yet you are here anyway, comfortable enough to prepare for sleep while understanding, on some level, that your evening rituals are not entirely private. This curious comfort with being watched, this acceptance of invisible observation as the normal condition of modern life, is precisely what we are going to explore tonight through the lens of two remarkable thinkers whose ideas illuminate our present moment with startling clarity. We will trace this phenomenon back to an 18th century English philosopher who designed a prison that was never fully built, and forward to a 20th century French thinker who recognized in that design a blueprint for modern society itself. We will discover how a building intended to watch prisoners became a metaphor for the way power operates today, not through chains or walls, but through the simple possibility that someone might be looking. And we will ask the unsettling question that hovers over our digital age: what happens to the self when it is always on display? The story we will tell tonight is not a happy one, though it contains moments of hope. It is a story about the transformation of power from something visible and violent to something invisible and psychological. It is a story about how observation became the primary mechanism of social control in modern societies. And it is a story about what happens to human beings when they can never be sure whether they are being watched. But this is not a story designed to frighten you into sleeplessness. Quite the opposite. Understanding the world we live in, seeing clearly the forces that shape our behavior, is itself a form of liberation. The prisoner who knows they are in a prison is freer than one who mistakes their cell for the whole world. The subject who understands how power operates has more room to maneuver than one who simply conforms without reflection. So settle in, let your breathing slow, and allow me to guide you through one of the most important philosophical ideas of our time. It begins with a man named Jeremy Bentham and a circular prison that exists mostly in the imagination. Jeremy Bentham was born in the year 1748 into a prosperous London family that expected great things from their prodigious child. From his earliest years, young Jeremy displayed abilities that marked him as exceptional. He reportedly learned to read before the age of 3 and began studying Latin shortly after. By the time he entered Oxford at just 12 years old, already a remarkably young age for university enrollment, he was recognized as possessing an intellect of unusual power and restlessness. His father, a successful attorney with social ambitions, dreamed that young Jeremy would become Lord Chancellor of England, the highest legal position in the land. The path seemed clear: a brilliant legal education, followed by a distinguished career at the bar, culminating in the prestige and power that had eluded the elder Bentham himself. But Jeremy had other ideas, and they would prove far more revolutionary than anything his father had imagined. After completing his legal training and gaining admission to the bar, Bentham became increasingly frustrated with the chaotic state of English law. It seemed to him a jumble of arbitrary customs, contradictory precedents, and irrational traditions accumulated over centuries without any guiding principle. The law was not a system at all, merely a collection of accidents that happened to have survived. Rather than pursue the brilliant legal career his father had envisioned, Bentham devoted himself to something far more ambitious. He wanted to redesign the entire system of laws and institutions according to rational principles. He wanted to create a society that functioned as smoothly and efficiently as a well-designed machine, where every part served a clear purpose and no energy was wasted. The guiding principle behind all of Bentham's thought was remarkably simple, elegant in its clarity. He believed that the purpose of law and government should be to produce the greatest happiness for the greatest number of people. This idea, which became known as utilitarianism, suggested that every institution, every practice, every building, every policy should be evaluated by a single criterion: Does it maximize overall well-being? Does it increase the sum total of human happiness while minimizing suffering? Armed with this powerful principle, Bentham turned his attention to virtually every aspect of social life. He attacked the educational system, the legal code, the political structure, the organization of prisons, the design of workplaces. Nothing escaped his reforming gaze. He believed that with enough careful thought, with enough rational analysis, every human institution could be redesigned to function more efficiently and more humanely. This was the spirit of the Enlightenment at its most optimistic and perhaps most naive. It expressed the conviction that reason could solve any problem, including the ancient problem of how to deal with those who broke society's rules. And it was this problem, the problem of punishment and reform, that would lead Bentham to his most famous and most troubling invention. In 1785, when Bentham was 37 years old and already recognized as one of England's most original thinkers, he undertook a journey that would change the direction of his thought. He traveled to Khrushchev, a town in what is now Belarus but was then part of the Russian Empire, to visit his younger brother Samuel. Samuel was working for Prince Potemkin, the powerful favorite of Catherine the Great, helping to manage a large industrial estate. Samuel Bentham was an engineer and inventor in his own right, and he had developed an innovative system for supervising workers. The key insight was architectural rather than managerial. If you arranged a workspace so that a supervisor could see all the workers at once while remaining hidden from their view, the workers would behave as if they were being watched continuously, even when the supervisor was not actually present, even when no one at all was looking. This principle of invisible oversight struck Jeremy Bentham like a bolt of lightning. He immediately saw that his brother's practical solution to the problem of managing workers contained within it something far more profound, a general principle for organizing institutions of all kinds. He began sketching plans for a building designed entirely around this idea of potential observation, and he called his creation the Panopticon. The word itself comes from Greek. Pan means all, and optikos relates to seeing or sight. So Panopticon means, quite literally, the all-seeing place. But the genius of the design was precisely that it did not require actual all-seeing at all. It only required the possibility of being seen, the uncertainty about whether you were watched at any given moment. Bentham's architectural design was elegant in its simplicity. Imagine a circular building, like a great wheel lying on its side. At the center of this wheel stands a tower. Around the circumference, arranged like the numbers on a clock face, are individual cells, perhaps dozens or hundreds of them depending on the size of the facility. Each cell has a window on the outer wall, facing outward toward the light, and an open front facing the central tower. The prisoner or worker or student in each cell is constantly illuminated by the light from the outer window, constantly visible to anyone who might be looking from the central tower. There is nowhere to hide, no corner of shadow, no moment of unobserved privacy. The arrangement of light and space makes the inhabitant of each cell perfectly legible to the watching eye. But here is where the design achieves its remarkable power. The tower itself is constructed so that the prisoners cannot see inside it. Venetian blinds or other architectural features shield the observers from view. The lighting is carefully arranged so that while the cells remain bright and exposed, the tower remains shadowed and mysterious. A prisoner can never know, at any given moment, whether someone in the tower is actually looking at them. They might be observed right now. At this very instant, they might not be. The uncertainty itself becomes a form of control. Bentham was rapturous about his invention. He described it as a new mode of obtaining power of mind over mind, in a quantity hitherto without example. Notice the precision of that phrase: not power over bodies, not physical restraint, not chains or beatings, power of mind over mind. The Panopticon was designed to change how people thought and felt, to remake their interior lives through the pressure of possible observation. The beauty of the design, from Bentham's utilitarian perspective, was its extraordinary efficiency. You did not need many guards to supervise many prisoners. In fact, you did not need constant supervision at all. The mere possibility of observation would be enough to compel good behavior. The prisoners would begin to watch themselves, to regulate their own conduct, to correct their own deviations from acceptable behavior. In effect, each prisoner would become their own guard. Now, it is important to understand that Bentham's intentions were genuinely reformist and, by the standards of his time, humanitarian. The prisons of 18th century England were horrifying places that would shock modern sensibilities. Prisoners were crowded together regardless of the severity of their offences. Disease ran rampant through the cramped and filthy cells. Guards were often corrupt and brutal. Rehabilitation was never even considered as a goal. Prison was simply a place of punishment and containment, a warehouse for those society wished to remove from circulation. Bentham believed his Panopticon would represent an enormous improvement over these hellholes. It would be cleaner, with proper ventilation and sanitation. It would be safer, with the constant potential for observation preventing the violence that thrived in the dark corners of traditional prisons. And most importantly, it would be reforming rather than merely punishing. The prisoners, knowing they were always potentially under the watchful eye of authority, would gradually internalize discipline. They would learn to regulate their own behavior, to control their own impulses, to align their conduct with social expectations. By the time they were released, they would have been transformed from chaotic criminals into orderly citizens, not through beatings or terror, but through the gentle, constant pressure of visibility. Bentham imagined extending this principle far beyond prison walls. He wrote enthusiastically about Panopticon schools, where teachers could observe all students simultaneously. He designed Panopticon workhouses for the poor, Panopticon hospitals for the sick, Panopticon factories for industrial production. Everywhere he looked, he saw opportunities to apply the principle of potential observation to make institutions more efficient and their inhabitants more governable. Inspired by his vision, Bentham spent nearly a decade lobbying Parliament to build a Panopticon prison. He acquired land on the banks of the Thames, drew up elaborate architectural plans, worked out every detail of the inspection system, down to the communication tubes that would allow the inspector to speak to individual prisoners from the central tower without ever leaving his station. He invested his own money and his considerable reputation in the project, but the Panopticon was repeatedly delayed, underfunded, politically entangled, and ultimately abandoned. The land Bentham had purchased eventually became the site of the Tate Britain Art Gallery, standing today as an ironic monument to the prison that never was. Bentham received some financial compensation for his troubles, but never recovered from what he perceived as a deliberate conspiracy by the aristocratic establishment to thwart his great reform. He died in 1832, bitter about the rejection of his most ambitious idea. In accordance with his will, his body was preserved and is still displayed at University College London, his eyes forever open in a kind of perpetual observation. A few prisons inspired by his designs were built around the world, most famously the Presidio Modelo in Cuba and several facilities in Europe, but none fully realized his comprehensive vision. It seemed as though the Panopticon would remain a historical curiosity, an eccentric footnote in the history of prison reform, a reminder of the Enlightenment's occasionally disturbing confidence in the power of rational design. The building that would watch everything remained mostly unbuilt, and the idea seemed to fade into obscurity. Then, nearly a century and a half later, a French philosopher looked at Bentham's circular prison and saw something far more troubling than its inventor had ever intended. In those diagrams and blueprints, he saw the architectural diagram of modern society itself. Michel Foucault was born on October 15, 1926, in the city of Poitiers in west-central France. His father was Paul Foucault, a successful surgeon who expected his son to follow him into the medical profession. His mother, Anne Malapert, came from a family of surgeons as well. Medicine was the family trade, and young Michel was expected to continue the tradition. But from an early age, something set Michel apart. He was brilliant, certainly, but brilliance was expected in his family. What made him different was harder to define, a restlessness of mind, an unwillingness to accept received wisdom, a tendency to question everything that others took for granted. He was also, by all accounts, a difficult and withdrawn child, sensitive to the point of fragility, struggling with an inner turmoil that he could not yet name or understand. The years of his youth were marked by the catastrophe of World War II and the German occupation of France. These experiences of social breakdown, of the collapse of normal life, of the arbitrary exercise of power left deep impressions on the young Foucault. He would later say that his entire philosophical project was shaped by the question of how power actually operates in society, particularly in moments when its operation becomes visible and brutal. After the war, Foucault pursued his studies at the most prestigious institutions in France. He gained admission to the École Normale Supérieure in Paris, the training ground for the French intellectual elite. There he studied philosophy under some of the leading thinkers of the day and began to develop his own distinctive voice. But he also struggled with depression and with his emerging homosexuality in a society that offered little understanding or acceptance for either. The early 1950s were particularly difficult. Foucault made at least one attempt on his own life during his university years. He sought psychological help and spent time as a patient in psychiatric facilities. These experiences, painful as they were, gave him an intimate understanding of how institutions deal with those they classify as deviant or abnormal. He saw from the inside how the labels applied by medical authorities could shape a person's entire life, how the gaze of the expert could transform a human being into a case study, a diagnosis, a problem to be managed. After completing his studies in philosophy and psychology, Foucault took positions at mental hospitals and psychiatric clinics. He worked at the Sainte-Anne Hospital in Paris, one of France's largest psychiatric facilities. He observed how patients were classified and sorted, how they were observed and documented, how their behaviors were interpreted through the lens of medical knowledge. He witnessed the subtle and not so subtle ways that institutions shaped the people within them, creating the very categories of normality and abnormality that justified their interventions. These experiences at the boundary between philosophy and psychiatry, between theory and institutional practice, planted the seeds of the questions that would occupy Foucault for the rest of his life. How does power actually work? Not the obvious power of kings and armies, the power that announces itself with trumpets and executions, but the quiet power that operates through doctors and teachers, through bureaucrats and administrators, through the countless small judgments that sort people into categories and shape their possibilities. Throughout the 1960s, Foucault produced a series of groundbreaking works that established him as one of the most original thinkers in France. His History of Madness traced how the modern concept of mental illness emerged from earlier understandings of unreason and folly. The Birth of the Clinic examined how medical knowledge developed through new ways of observing and classifying bodies. The Order of Things analyzed the deep structures of thought that organized different historical periods. These books established Foucault's distinctive method, the historical investigation of how categories that seem natural and inevitable are actually products of specific historical developments. In the early 1970s, Foucault became deeply involved in political activism, particularly around the issue of prisons. The French prison system was in crisis. Prisoners were organizing, protesting the conditions of their confinement, demanding that their voices be heard. Foucault saw an opportunity to connect his theoretical investigations with concrete political struggle. In 1971, he founded an organization called the Prison Information Group, known by its French initials GIP. The group's stated purpose was not to prescribe reforms from above, but to give prisoners themselves a voice in public debates about incarceration. Foucault and his collaborators collected testimonies from prisoners and their families, organized press conferences, and staged protests. They challenged the comfortable assumption that experts and reformers knew what was best for those behind bars. This was not abstract academic work conducted in the comfortable isolation of libraries and seminar rooms. It was engagement with the reality of how society punished and controlled those it deemed unacceptable. Foucault visited prisons, interviewed inmates, confronted guards and administrators, and risked arrest at demonstrations. The experience transformed his thinking, grounding his philosophical investigations in the concrete realities of institutional power. Out of this combination of theoretical reflection and political activism came one of the most influential works of 20th century thought. In 1975, Foucault published Surveiller et punir, Naissance de la prison, translated into English 2 years later as Discipline and Punish, The Birth of the Prison. The title alone, with its pairing of surveillance and punishment, signaled that Foucault was offering a radically different understanding of how modern societies deal with their deviants. The book opens with a scene of almost unbearable violence. Foucault describes in graphic detail the public execution of Robert François Damiens in Paris in 1757. Damiens had attempted to assassinate King Louis XV, and his punishment was designed to match the enormity of his crime. Over the course of several hours, before a large public audience, Damiens was tortured with red-hot pincers, his hand was burned with sulfur, and molten lead was poured into his wounds. Finally, 4 horses were attached to his limbs to tear his body apart, though this required considerable effort and repeated attempts before succeeding. The details are precise, clinical, drawn from contemporary accounts of the execution. Then Foucault jumps forward about 80 years to present a very different document, the timetable of a typical day in a 19th-century prison. The contrast could not be more striking. Here is no spectacular violence, no public torture, no dramatic assertion of royal power. Instead, there is a detailed schedule of activities, rising at a certain hour, prayers at another, meals, work, exercise, sleep. Every moment is accounted for, every activity regulated, every minute organized according to rational principles. Most readers would assume that this shift from torture to timetable represents moral progress, the triumph of humanitarian reform over barbaric cruelty. Foucault does not deny that something changed, but he insists that we have misunderstood the nature of the change if we see it simply as improvement. The old system of punishment was spectacular, bloody, and focused entirely on the body. It was designed to display the absolute power of the sovereign through the destruction of the criminal's flesh. The new system was quiet, invisible, and aimed at something much more intimate, the soul of the prisoner. This shift, Foucault argues, represents not the disappearance of power, but its transformation into a more effective and more insidious form. The old power of the king was dramatic but inefficient. It could destroy bodies, but it could not shape minds. It operated through public displays of force, through spectacular punishments that reminded everyone of the sovereign's absolute authority. But such power was also intermittent. The king could not be everywhere at once. Most people, most of the time, lived outside his direct gaze. The new power that emerged in the 18th and 19th centuries, the power that organized the prison timetable, was something quite different. It was subtle rather than spectacular, continuous rather than intermittent, deeply penetrating rather than focused on the surface of the body. Rather than punishing bodies after the fact, it sought to shape souls in advance. Rather than asserting itself through violent displays, it operated through quiet observation, through the gentle but relentless pressure of norms and expectations. Foucault called this new form of power disciplinary power. The mechanisms of disciplinary power were diverse, but they shared certain common features. First, there was hierarchical observation, the arrangement of spaces so that those in authority could see those under their control. Think of the classroom with its rows of desks facing the teacher's elevated position. Think of the hospital ward with its open beds visible from the nursing station. Think of the factory floor with its supervisor's elevated walkway overlooking the workers below. These arrangements are so familiar that we rarely notice them, yet they all share the same principle, making the subordinate visible to the superior. There was normalizing judgment, the establishment of standards against which individuals could be measured and found wanting. The normal student learns certain things at certain ages, the normal worker produces at certain rates, the normal patient recovers according to expected timelines. Those who deviate from these norms are identified, documented, and subjected to interventions designed to bring them back into conformity. Normalization does not simply punish wrongdoing, it creates a detailed map of acceptable behavior against which every individual is constantly measured. A technique that combined observation with judgment. When a doctor examines a patient, when a teacher tests a student, when an employer evaluates an employee, they are simultaneously watching and judging. They are gathering information about the individual, while also comparing that individual to established standards. The examination creates what Foucault calls power knowledge. Those who control the process of observation also control the definition of normality, and those who define normality also control those who are measured against it. And at the heart of all these mechanisms stood Bentham's Panopticon. Foucault found in that unbuilt prison not just a clever architectural design, but a diagram of how modern society actually functions. The principle of constant potential observation, he argued, had spread far beyond prison walls. It had infiltrated schools, hospitals, factories, and military barracks. Everywhere you looked, modern institutions were designed to make individuals visible, to sort them according to norms, to judge them against standards, and to shape them into useful and obedient subjects. Consider the school where you spent your childhood years. The physical arrangement of the classroom placed you in full view of the teacher. Your performance was constantly evaluated through tests and grades. Your behavior was monitored and corrected. You learned not just reading and arithmetic, but how to sit still, how to pay attention, how to conform to expectations, how to regulate your own body according to institutional requirements. The school, Foucault suggested, operates on essentially the same principles as Bentham's prison, though with gentler methods and different goals. Or consider the modern workplace. You arrive at a specific time, recorded by a time clock or computer login. You perform tasks according to established procedures. Your productivity is measured against targets and benchmarks. Your efficiency is evaluated in periodic reviews. Even if no supervisor is actually watching at any given moment, you behave as if someone might be. You have internalized the discipline that the organization requires. You have become, in effect, your own manager. Or consider the hospital where you might go when ill. You are examined, measured, documented. Your symptoms are compared to established diagnostic categories. Your treatment follows protocols derived from statistical analysis of similar cases. Your progress is monitored through regular observations. You become a case, a file, a data point in a system of medical knowledge that exists independently of your individual experience. This was Foucault's most disturbing insight, the one that resonates so powerfully in our present moment. The true genius of modern power is that it does not require actual surveillance. It only requires the possibility of surveillance, maintained constantly enough that people begin to watch themselves. The prisoner in the Panopticon does not need a guard watching at all times. In fact, the guard need not be present at all. The prisoner eventually becomes their own guard, monitoring their own behavior, correcting their own deviations from acceptable conduct, punishing themselves for failures to conform. Foucault introduced a term for this process that has become central to understanding contemporary life: normalization. Disciplinary power works not primarily through spectacular punishments, but by establishing what is normal and creating constant pressure to conform to that standard. The normal child develops at certain rates. The normal worker produces at certain levels. The normal body falls within certain parameters of height and weight and function. Those who deviate from these carefully calibrated norms are identified, studied, classified, and subjected to interventions designed to bring them back into line. The examination, Foucault argued, represents the perfect combination of observation and normalization. When a doctor examines a patient, when a teacher grades a student, when an employer reviews an employee, when a psychologist evaluates a subject, they are simultaneously watching and judging. They are gathering knowledge about the individual while comparing that individual to established standards of normality. This combination of observation and judgment is what Foucault called power knowledge. Those who control the standards of normality also control the individuals who are measured against them. Knowledge and power are not separate but intertwined, each producing and reinforcing the other. But perhaps the most unsettling aspect of Foucault's analysis is what happens inside the individuals who live under disciplinary power. We do not simply comply with external surveillance while maintaining an inner freedom. We internalize the surveillance itself. We become our own observers, our own judges, our own disciplinarians. We watch ourselves with the same critical eye that the institution would turn on us. We correct our own deviations, sometimes before we are even aware of deviating. We punish ourselves mentally and emotionally for our failures to conform. This internalization is what makes disciplinary power so remarkably efficient and so difficult to resist. The king's soldiers could be evaded, the torturer's instruments could be endured. But how do you escape from a prison that exists inside your own mind? How do you resist power that operates through your own thoughts, your own self-judgment, your own desire to be normal? Foucault died in Paris on June 25, 1984, one of the first prominent public figures in France to die from complications of AIDS. He did not live to see the personal computer become ubiquitous on desks around the world. He never used email or browsed the internet. He did not own a smartphone or create a social media profile. He could not have imagined the data centers that now store the digital traces of billions of lives, the algorithms that predict our behavior, the platforms that monetize our attention. And yet his analysis of disciplinary power, of the Panopticon, of the internalization of surveillance, has proven prophetic in ways that even he might not have anticipated. The disciplinary society he described, with its schools and hospitals and factories organized around the principle of observation, was merely a prelude to something far more comprehensive, far more penetrating, far more inescapable. If Foucault could see our world today, what would he make of it? We can only speculate, but the outlines are clear enough. He would recognize in the smartphone the perfect disciplinary device, a panopticon you carry willingly in your pocket. He would see in social media the logical extension of visibility into every corner of daily life. He would note how the examination, that combination of observation and judgment that he saw as central to disciplinary power, has been automated and made continuous through algorithmic evaluation. But he would also recognize possibilities for resistance that the digital age has created. The same technologies that enable surveillance also enable counter-surveillance, the ability to watch the watchers, to document abuse of power, to coordinate resistance across distances. The same networks that extract data from individuals also allow individuals to share knowledge about how they are being surveilled. Foucault understood that power and resistance are locked in an endless dance, each adapting to the other, neither achieving final victory. This dialectic of power and resistance is perhaps the most valuable legacy of Foucault's thought. It refuses both naive optimism and paralyzing despair. It acknowledges the pervasiveness of surveillance while insisting on the possibility of negotiation and subversion. It takes power seriously without treating it as absolute or unchangeable. When the internet first emerged into public consciousness in the 1990s, it seemed to promise something remarkable: freedom. Here was a space without borders, without gatekeepers, without authorities controlling what could be said or who could say it. The early visionaries of cyberspace imagined it as a new frontier, a place where identity was fluid and surveillance was technically impossible. You could be anyone online. No one knew if you were a dog. The old constraints of physical location and social position seemed to dissolve in the electronic ether. A famous early manifesto declared that cyberspace was naturally immune to sovereignty. The governments of the industrial world had no authority in this new domain. Communities would form around shared interests rather than geographical accident. Information would flow freely across borders. The panopticon of the physical world would give way to the anonymity of the digital one. That dream of digital freedom lasted about a decade. It founded not on the interventions of government, but on the requirements of business. By 2001, the major internet companies faced a crisis. The dot-com bubble had burst spectacularly. Stock prices that had risen to dizzying heights crashed back to earth. Venture capital that had flowed freely into any company with a website suddenly dried up. Google, the search engine that millions had come to rely on for navigating the vast new territory of the web, was burning through money with no clear path to profitability. It needed a business model, and it needed one fast. The solution that emerged would reshape the world far more profoundly than any government regulation could have done. Google realized that it was sitting on an extraordinary asset that it had barely begun to exploit: the behavioral data generated by its users. Every search query, every click, every pattern of activity created traces that revealed something about the person behind the keyboard. At first, this data was used only to improve the search service itself, to refine the algorithms that matched queries to results. But Google's engineers realized that this data could be used for something far more valuable than service improvement. It could be used for prediction. If you knew what someone had searched for in the past, you could make reasonable guesses about what they might want in the future. And if you could predict what someone wanted, you could sell that prediction to someone willing to pay for it. The insight seems simple in retrospect, but its implications were revolutionary. Suddenly, the free service that Google offered was not really free at all. Users were paying, just not with money. They were paying with their behavioral data, which Google then refined into predictions and sold to advertisers. The more users searched, the more data Google collected. The more data Google collected, the better its predictions became. The better its predictions, the more advertisers would pay for them. This was the birth of what the scholar Shoshana Zuboff has called surveillance capitalism, a new economic logic in which human experience itself becomes raw material for the production of prediction products. Every click, every scroll, every pause, every search, every like, every share is captured, analyzed, refined, and transformed into commodities to be bought and sold in what Zuboff calls behavioral futures markets. The process works something like this. When you use a free online service, whether a search engine, a social media platform, an email provider, or a mapping application, you generate data about your behavior. Some of this data is genuinely useful for improving the service you receive. But much of it is what Zuboff calls behavioral surplus. Data beyond what is needed for service improvement, data that can be fed into machine learning systems and used to predict your future behavior. These predictions are then sold to business customers who have an interest in knowing what you will do next. Advertisers want to know what products you might be interested in buying. Political campaigns want to know what messages might persuade you. Insurance companies want to know whether you are a good or bad risk. Employers want to know whether you will be a reliable worker. The market for predictions about human behavior has grown into a multi-hundred-billion-dollar industry. But here is what makes surveillance capitalism fundamentally different from the disciplinary power that Foucault described. The Panopticon was designed to change behavior by making people feel watched. The prisoners knew they were in a prison. They understood that they might be observed. That awareness was precisely what was supposed to change their conduct. Surveillance capitalism operates differently. It aims not just to observe behavior, but to shape it, often without the knowledge or consent of those being shaped. Zuboff calls this the shift from monitoring to what data scientists call actuating. Consider how social media platforms are designed. The infinite scroll keeps you engaged longer than you intended, feeding you content indefinitely until you make an active effort to stop. The notification bell triggers neural pathways associated with anticipation and reward, the same pathways that slot machines exploit. The like button provides intermittent reinforcement that has been carefully engineered to maximize engagement and, yes, addiction. These are not neutral features that happen to be popular. They are techniques for capturing and directing human attention, for keeping eyes on screens where that attention can be monetized. The smartphone in your pocket is perhaps the most sophisticated surveillance device ever invented, and you carry it willingly, eagerly, everywhere you go. It knows where you are at all times through GPS tracking that can locate you within a few meters. It tracks your movements through the day, creating a detailed record of everywhere you go and how long you stay. It can access your contacts, your messages, your photographs, your browsing history, your search queries, your purchase records. The applications installed on it request permissions to your microphone, your camera, your location, your health data, your financial information. Each app you install creates data streams that flow to servers around the world. These streams are analyzed, combined with other data sources, sold to third parties, and transformed into predictions about what you might do, buy, think, or feel tomorrow. The advertising industry alone processes trillions of data points about billions of people every day, conducting what amounts to the largest surveillance operation in human history, and it extends far beyond your phone. The smart speaker in your living room listens continuously, waiting for its wake word, but in order to hear that word, it must be processing everything said in its range. The smart television in your bedroom tracks what you watch and reports it to analytics companies that build profiles of your viewing habits. The fitness tracker on your wrist monitors your heart rate, your sleep patterns, your physical activity, your stress levels. The smart thermostat in your home learns when you are present and when you are away. The smart refrigerator in your kitchen can track what you eat. Each of these devices extends the architecture of observation deeper into the intimate spaces of daily life. The home, which used to be thought of as a refuge from public visibility, has become another node in the network of surveillance. There is nowhere to hide, not because guards are watching, but because you have invited the watchers in and installed them on your walls and in your pockets and on your wrists. There is an industry you have probably never heard of that trades in the data these devices generate. Data brokers are companies that buy information from various sources, combine it into comprehensive profiles, and sell those profiles to anyone willing to pay. They compile dossiers on hundreds of millions of people that include not just names and addresses, but purchasing habits, health conditions, political views, religious affiliations, family relationships, daily routines, income levels, and psychological characteristics. These profiles are bought by advertisers who want to target their messages more precisely. They are bought by employers who want to screen job applicants. They are bought by landlords who want to evaluate potential tenants. They are bought by insurance companies who want to calculate risks. They are bought by political campaigns who want to identify and persuade potential supporters. The market for personal data is vast, largely unregulated, and almost entirely invisible to the people whose lives are being bought and sold. In 2018, the world got a glimpse of where this could lead when the Cambridge Analytica scandal revealed how behavioral data from tens of millions of Facebook users had been harvested without meaningful consent and used to build psychological profiles for political targeting. The details were disturbing enough. A personality quiz that harvested data not just from users, but from all their Facebook friends. Promises about academic research that masked commercial and political purposes. Profiles that sorted people by their psychological vulnerabilities and crafted messages designed to exploit those vulnerabilities. But the deeper lesson was about the architecture of the system itself. Cambridge Analytica did not need to hack anyone's account or steal anyone's password. It simply took advantage of data that Facebook had made available through its own systems, data that Facebook itself had collected from its users and their networks. The scandal was not an aberration, but a revelation of how the system was designed to work all along. What companies like Cambridge Analytica understood is that behavioral prediction is not just useful for selling products. It can be weaponized to influence the most consequential decisions citizens make in a democracy. If you know enough about people, if you can predict their fears and desires and emotional triggers, you can craft messages that bypass rational deliberation and push psychological buttons they do not even know they have. The marketplace of ideas becomes a marketplace of manipulation. But surveillance capitalism, for all its invasiveness, is not quite the same as the Panopticon. Bentham's prisoners knew they were being watched. That knowledge was precisely what was supposed to change their behavior. They were conscious of their visibility, and that consciousness was the mechanism of control. The subjects of surveillance capitalism often have no idea how comprehensively their lives are being recorded and analyzed. The data extraction happens largely invisibly, buried in terms of service agreements that no one reads, enabled by permissions granted without understanding, processed in data centers whose locations and operations are carefully guarded secrets. And yet there is one domain where the Panopticon metaphor fits almost perfectly, where the principle of visible observation and internalized surveillance operates with remarkable power. There is one arena where we are constantly visible, where we perform continuously for an audience, where we have internalized the watching eye to such a degree that we can no longer clearly distinguish between who we are and who we display ourselves to be. That arena is social media. When Mark Zuckerberg built Facebook in his Harvard dormitory room, he articulated a vision that would have made Bentham proud. He imagined a world characterized by what he called radical transparency, where people would share everything about their lives with their networks. In this world, individuals would have nothing to hide because hiding would become impossible and therefore unnecessary. The old boundaries between public and private would dissolve. Authenticity would triumph because everyone would know everything about everyone else. This vision sounds almost utopian when stated this directly. No more secrets, no more performances, no more gaps between who we really are and who we pretend to be. Just openness and honesty and connection facilitated by a platform that makes sharing effortless. But consider what it actually means to live in a world of permanent visibility. It means never being unobserved, never having a moment that is not potentially documented. It means constantly curating a version of yourself for public consumption, selecting which aspects of your life to display and which to hide, editing your thoughts before expressing them, considering how each post might be received by an audience you cannot fully see. It means knowing that every thought you share, every image you post, every preference you express, every connection you make becomes part of a permanent record that might be searched, analyzed, and judged by future employers, romantic partners, government agencies, or curious strangers, years or decades into the future. Social media has created what Foucault could only have dreamed about analyzing. A voluntary panopticon that billions of people have willingly entered. We were not forced into these platforms at gunpoint. We signed up eagerly, drawn by the promise of connection and the pleasure of sharing. We post photographs of our meals, our vacations, our children. We share our thoughts on politics, our reactions to news, our emotional states at 2 a.m. We chronicle the minutiae of our days for an audience that includes not just our friends but the platform itself, its advertisers, its data partners, its algorithms, and who knows how many other unseen watchers. This is not surveillance imposed from above by a totalitarian state. This is self-surveillance, enacted voluntarily, often eagerly. We have become our own prison guards, documenting our own lives with an enthusiasm that the most ambitious authoritarian regime could never have commanded through force. But there is something even more unsettling happening beneath the surface. Social media has not just made us visible, it has changed what visibility means and who is doing the watching. In Bentham's original Panopticon, the prisoner was watched by an unseen authority figure in the central tower. The power relationship was clear. Authority watched from above, while the prisoner was watched from below. On social media, we are watched by everyone, and we are watching everyone else. Scholars have called this lateral surveillance or social surveillance to distinguish it from the top-down observation of the classic panopticon. Your Facebook friends can see your posts. Your Instagram followers can see your stories. Your Twitter mentions can be read by anyone with an internet connection. But more than seeing, they are watching in the sense that matters for the panopticon. They are potential sources of judgment, evaluation, and social consequence. This horizontal visibility produces psychological effects that are distinctive to our era. Consider the phenomenon that has come to be called FOMO, the fear of missing out. When you can see in real time what your friends are doing without you, when you can scroll through photographs of parties you were not invited to and vacations you cannot afford and achievements you have not matched, you experience a constant awareness that others are living lives more interesting, more successful, more fulfilled than your own. This awareness is not accidental. Social media platforms are designed to trigger FOMO because fear drives engagement, and engagement drives revenue. Or consider the careful curation that goes into the presentation of the digital self. Most people do not post unflattering photographs of themselves on Instagram. They select the best angles, the most flattering light, the moments of apparent happiness and success. They do not share their failures, their doubts, their moments of ugliness and despair. They construct a highlight reel of their lives, a carefully edited version of themselves that exists for the consumption of others. The result is a gap between the performed self and the actual self that grows wider with every curated post. You know that your own life contains frustrations and disappointments and ordinary moments that never make it to your feed. But when you look at others' feeds, you see only the highlights, only the successes, only the moments deemed worthy of sharing. The comparison is inherently unfair, your actual life against their performed life, and it produces predictable effects on well-being. Research has documented alarming trends in mental health that correlate with social media use, particularly among young people. Rates of anxiety and depression have risen sharply among teenagers in the years since smartphones and social media became ubiquitous. Hospital admissions for self-harm have increased dramatically among adolescent girls. Teen suicide rates have climbed after years of decline. Whether social media directly causes these problems or merely correlates with them remains a matter of scientific debate. The relationships are complex, the data are imperfect, and correlation does not prove causation. But the mechanisms through which social media might contribute to psychological distress are easy to imagine. Constant comparison to others' curated lives breeds inadequacy. Constant visibility to peer judgment creates anxiety. Constant availability to be contacted at any hour prevents the disengagement necessary for rest and recovery. The psychological environment of unrelenting exposure takes its toll. There is something particularly poignant about the generations who have grown up knowing nothing else. Young people born in the 2000s have been photographed and posted since infancy. Their first steps were shared with hundreds of people. Their childhood embarrassments exist permanently in cloud storage. They have never known a world where being offline was the default state, where privacy was assumed rather than fought for, where one's thoughts were private until deliberately shared. These young people have developed, out of necessity, sophisticated strategies for managing their digital visibility. They maintain multiple accounts, public ones carefully curated for college admissions officers and future employers, private ones for more intimate sharing with trusted friends. They understand intuitively what earlier generations have had to learn, that everything posted online can be screenshotted, shared, and weaponized. They navigate the Panopticon with a fluency that their parents often lack. But even sophisticated navigation cannot escape the fundamental architecture of the system. Social media platforms are designed to maximize engagement, which means maximizing time spent on the platform, which means exploiting every psychological vulnerability that can keep eyes on screens. The notification systems are modeled on slot machines, providing intermittent rewards that trigger dopamine responses. The variable reinforcement of likes and comments creates patterns of behavior that meet clinical definitions of addiction. The algorithms that determine what content you see are optimized not for your well-being, but for your attention. What does it do to a person to be always performing? What happens to the interior life when there is always an audience, real or imagined? These are questions that Foucault never had to ask directly, but they arise naturally from his analysis of disciplinary power. If that power works by making people internalize surveillance, by getting them to watch and judge themselves through the imagined eyes of authority, then social media represents something like the culmination of that process. We have not just internalized a single watching eye. We have multiplied it infinitely across our networks of friends, followers, algorithms, and unknown observers. The self that emerges from constant visibility is a self always conscious of being seen. Every thought is filtered through awareness of how it might appear to others. Every emotion is partly performed for an imagined audience. Every choice is made with consideration of how it will play on the feed. Authenticity becomes impossible, not because people are deliberately lying, but because the very concept of a private self, separate from public presentation, begins to dissolve. And yet the digital panopticon does not stop at the voluntary surveillance of social media. It extends into physical space through architectures of control that make Bentham's circular prison seem almost quaint by comparison. Consider what has emerged in China under the name of the social credit system. This is perhaps the most explicit attempt in the contemporary world to apply panoptic principles to the governance of an entire society. The system, which remains under development with various components operating in different regions, integrates data from surveillance cameras equipped with facial recognition, from online transactions and social media activity, from court records and government databases, and uses algorithms to evaluate citizens and businesses according to their trustworthiness. The precise details vary from place to place and are often exaggerated in Western media coverage. There is not, as some accounts suggest, a single unified score that determines every aspect of a citizen's life. The system is fragmented, experimental, and primarily focused on business compliance rather than individual behavior. The dystopian visions of a totalitarian algorithm controlling access to housing, employment, and travel are more projection than reality, but the direction is clear enough, and it is troubling. As of 2025, China operates an estimated 600 million surveillance cameras, many equipped with artificial intelligence capable of recognizing faces, detecting emotions, tracking movements, and analyzing behavior. In some pilot cities, jaywalking across an empty street can result in your photograph being displayed on a nearby screen with your name and a notice of your infraction. The infrastructure for comprehensive behavioral monitoring exists and continues to expand. Courts maintain blacklists of individuals who have failed to comply with legal judgments, restricting their ability to purchase airline tickets, stay in certain hotels, or access credit. Businesses are rated according to their compliance with regulations and their reliability in fulfilling contracts. The explicit goal is to create a society in which trust can be calculated algorithmically, in which reputation becomes a quantifiable asset that can be accumulated or depleted through documented behavior. What makes this relevant beyond China is that similar tendencies exist throughout the world, though often in less explicit and less centralized forms. In the United States, your credit score already affects your access to housing, employment, insurance, and financial services. Background check companies compile dossiers on millions of people that can determine whether they get hired, whether they can rent an apartment, whether they receive favorable terms on loans. Insurance companies increasingly use data analytics to price policies based on behavioral predictions rather than just demographic categories. The workplace has become another site of intensive surveillance. Employers can monitor every keystroke on company computers, tracking not just what you produce but how you produce it, how often you pause, which websites you visit, how long you spend on each task. They can read emails and instant messages sent through company systems. They can track the physical locations of workers through GPS, badge readers, and mobile device monitoring. Remote work during the pandemic accelerated these trends as companies deployed software to monitor home-based employees through webcams, activity tracking, and regular check-ins. Schools have adopted similar technologies with enthusiasm. AI systems monitor students' online activities for signs of concerning behavior, flagging keywords and patterns that might indicate threats, bullying, or self-harm. Proctoring software watches students through their webcams during remote exams, analyzing eye movements and keyboard patterns for signs of cheating. Applications track engagement in real time and alert teachers when attention seems to wander. Children are learning, from increasingly early ages, that being watched is the normal condition of institutional life. The physical spaces we move through are increasingly instrumented for observation. Automatic license plate readers track the movements of millions of vehicles, creating databases of who went where and when. Facial recognition systems are deployed in airports, stadiums, retail stores, and public squares. The smart city initiatives being developed around the world explicitly aim to make urban environments completely legible to algorithmic analysis, with sensors monitoring traffic flow, crowd density, noise levels, air quality, and countless other variables. Perhaps most intimate is the biometric data now routinely collected by various systems. Your face is a unique identifier that cameras can recognize from a distance, even as you age or change your appearance. Your voice can be used for authentication, its unique patterns as distinctive as a fingerprint. Your gait, the particular way you walk, can be identified even when your face is hidden. Your fingerprints, your iris patterns, your heart rate, your brainwaves, your DNA, all of these are forms of data that can be captured, analyzed, stored, and used to identify you, track you, predict your behavior. There is a common response to all of this that deserves examination. People often say that they have nothing to hide, and therefore surveillance does not concern them. If you are not doing anything wrong, the argument goes, why should you care who is watching? You should welcome surveillance because it catches criminals and prevents terrorism and keeps society safe. Foucault's analysis explains precisely why this response misses the point entirely. Surveillance does not simply catch wrongdoers after they have done wrong. It shapes behavior in advance. It creates a particular kind of subject, one that is always conscious of potential observation, always monitoring their own conformity to perceived norms, always performing for an imagined audience. Even if you have nothing to hide, the knowledge that you are being watched changes what you do and who you are. Research has documented what scholars call the chilling effect of surveillance on behavior. When people know or believe they are being watched, they are less likely to search for controversial information online. They are less likely to express unpopular opinions in forums where their identity is known. They are less likely to engage in unconventional behavior, even perfectly legal unconventional behavior. They conform more closely to what they perceive as expected and acceptable, even when no one is explicitly telling them what to do and no punishment threatens for deviation. This is exactly the mechanism that Bentham described, the power of mind over mind operating through the mere possibility of observation. You do not need to actually be watched all the time. You only need to believe that you might be watched at any time. That uncertainty, that awareness of potential visibility, is enough to produce self-surveillance, self-correction, self-discipline. The Panopticon works from inside. The implications for democracy and free society are particularly concerning. Democratic self-government depends on the ability of citizens to think independently, to question authority, to organize around unpopular causes, to challenge the existing distribution of power. If surveillance creates populations that instinctively avoid controversy, that self-censor their thoughts before expressing them, that conform preemptively to perceived expectations, then the conditions for meaningful democratic participation are eroded from within. What becomes of political organizing when every meeting might be monitored, every message might be stored, every association might be documented? What becomes of whistleblowing when anonymity is impossible? What becomes of journalism when sources cannot communicate secretly? What becomes of dissent when deviating from the norm carries social and economic costs that algorithms can calculate and impose? And yet, even as the architecture of surveillance expands and deepens, even as the Panopticon extends its reach into every corner of contemporary life, resistance emerges. Foucault himself reminded us that where there is power, there is always resistance. Power does not simply dominate absolutely. It provokes counter-movements, adaptations, subversions, escapes. The Panopticon is powerful, but it is not all-powerful. It has weaknesses, gaps, blind spots, and those can be found and exploited. Some forms of resistance are technological. Virtual private networks can obscure your internet activity from your service provider and from casual observers. Encrypted messaging applications like Signal can protect the content of your communications from interception, making the messages unreadable to anyone who does not hold the encryption keys. Privacy-focused browsers and search engines can reduce the data trails you leave as you move through the web. These tools are imperfect, but they provide meaningful protection for those who take the trouble to learn and use them. Other forms of resistance are legal and political. The European Union's General Data Protection Regulation, implemented in 2018, established meaningful constraints on how companies can collect and use personal data, including requirements for meaningful consent, rights to access and delete data, and significant penalties for violations. The EU's AI Act, adopted in 2024, explicitly prohibits social scoring systems and certain uses of facial recognition. Advocacy groups around the world are pushing for stronger privacy protections, greater algorithmic accountability, and more meaningful limits on surveillance by both governments and corporations. There is also a cultural shift happening, particularly among younger people, who have grown up immersed in the digital panopticon and are beginning to question its costs. Movements towards digital minimalism, toward reducing social media use and screen time, toward phone-free schools and device-free bedrooms and offline hours, represent a growing recognition that constant connectivity has psychological costs that may outweigh its benefits. The very generation that has known nothing but surveillance is beginning to articulate a desire for spaces of non-observation, for time and places where the watching eye cannot reach. Perhaps most importantly, awareness itself is a form of resistance. Understanding how surveillance operates, recognizing the mechanisms by which observation shapes behavior, seeing the invisible architectures of data extraction and behavioral prediction, these are necessary first steps toward reclaiming some measure of autonomy. You cannot resist what you do not perceive. You cannot choose differently if you do not recognize that a choice exists. Foucault never offered easy solutions or blueprints for liberation. He was too intellectually honest for that. He understood that power is not simply something imposed from outside that can be overthrown and replaced with freedom. Disciplinary power operates through us, within us, constituting the very selves that might want to resist it. The subject that emerges from modern institutions is always already shaped by those institutions. There is no pure, authentic, pre-surveilled self waiting to be liberated if only we could escape the panopticon. But Foucault also believed in the possibility of what he called counter-conduct, ways of living and thinking that refuse to be entirely captured by the systems that seek to shape us. These are not grand revolutionary gestures but daily practices of resistance. Small refusals and quiet subversions that open up spaces for different ways of being. Every time someone logs off social media to be alone with their thoughts, every time someone chooses not to share something that could easily be shared, every time someone protects their privacy in a world that constantly pressures transparency, every time someone questions the imperative to be seen and counted and measured, they enact a small rebellion against the panoptic order. The bedroom where you are listening to these words tonight is one of the last spaces that might claim to be private. The door is closed. The lights are dim. No cameras watch you directly, though your phone lies nearby. Its sensors quiet but not entirely asleep. Sleep itself is perhaps the only state in which we stop performing entirely, in which the curated self dissolves and something more authentic, or at least more unconscious, takes over. There is something valuable in this, something worth protecting. The capacity for solitude, for unwatched time, for thoughts that are never shared and never documented and never analyzed. These are conditions for the development of a self that is more than a performance. The philosopher Hannah Arendt argued that thinking itself requires withdrawal from the public eye, moments of solitude in which the self can dialogue with itself without concern for how it appears to others. If we lose the ability to be alone, if we are always visible, always performing, always conscious of the watching eye, we may lose the capacity for the kind of reflection that makes us distinctively human. As you settle deeper into rest tonight, consider what these ideas mean for your own life. You have lived through the construction of the digital panopticon. You remember perhaps a time before smartphones, before social media, before the constant hum of algorithmic observation. You have felt the pull of the attention economy, the addictive draw of notifications and likes and shares. You have curated your own digital presence and perhaps wondered about the gap between who you display and who you actually are. Perhaps tonight can be a small exercise in counter-conduct, a decision to put the phone aside, to let the notifications wait, to exist for a few hours without documentation and display, without performance for an audience. Sleep, after all, is one activity that cannot be optimized for algorithmic analysis, one domain where productivity metrics do not apply. Your dreams, whatever they may be, are still your own. Michel Foucault wrote that the soul is the prison of the body, by which he meant that disciplinary power operates not by confining our physical selves, but by shaping the interior spaces of thought, desire, and self-understanding. We become our own jailers when we internalize the watching eye, when we monitor and correct and judge ourselves according to standards we did not choose and norms we did not create. But if the soul can be a prison, perhaps it can also be a refuge. Perhaps there are depths within us that surveillance cannot reach, spaces of imagination and dream and private reflection that remain, against all odds and all technologies, truly our own. Perhaps the self is more resilient than the Panopticon assumes, capable of flourishing even within systems designed to observe and control and predict every aspect of its existence. Tonight, as you drift towards sleep, you participate in an ancient human ritual that no technology has yet fully captured. Consciousness dissolves into unconsciousness. The performing self releases its grip. The watching eye, internal and external, closes for a time. For a few hours, you exist without audience, without observation, without the constant pressure to be seen and measured and optimized. In that dissolution, perhaps, there is something like freedom. Let us linger a little longer with these thoughts before sleep claims you entirely. There is more to consider about how we might live in this world of perpetual visibility, more wisdom to draw from Foucault's unsettling insights. Consider the workplace you inhabit, whether an office, a factory, a store, or your own home, transformed during the pandemic into a remote working space. The modern workplace is perhaps the clearest contemporary example of panoptic architecture in action. The open-plan office, celebrated by management consultants as promoting collaboration and transparency, is also a space where everyone can see everyone else, where solitary contemplation becomes difficult, where the appearance of busyness becomes as important as actual productivity. Studies have found that workers in open-plan offices experience more stress, more distractions, and lower job satisfaction than those in private spaces. They take more sick days. They report feeling watched, and yet the trend toward open-plan offices has continued for decades, despite the mounting evidence of its costs, because visibility serves managerial interests even when it undermines worker well-being. The architecture that makes workers visible also makes them manageable. For those who work remotely, the surveillance has simply followed them home. Software that tracks keystrokes and mouse movements, that takes periodic screenshots, that monitors which applications are open and for how long, that even activates webcams to verify physical presence. All of this became normalized during the pandemic lockdowns when employers suddenly could not see their workers directly. The home office, once imagined as a space of greater freedom and autonomy, has become another site of observation. And what of the educational institutions that shape the young? Schools have always operated on panoptic principles, the classroom designed for visibility, the examination designed to judge against norms, but the digital transformation of education has intensified these tendencies dramatically. Learning management systems track every click, every submission, every time a student accesses course materials. Proctoring software watches students through their webcams during exams, analyzing eye movements and facial expressions for signs of cheating. AI systems monitor student writing for plagiarism, their communications for signs of mental health crises or violent intentions. Consider what it means to grow up in such an environment. Children learn from their earliest school years that their digital activities are monitored, that their communications may be read, that algorithms are watching for deviations from expected behavior. They learn to perform academic engagement even when their minds are elsewhere. They learn to be careful about what they write, knowing it may be flagged and examined. They internalize surveillance as the normal condition of institutional life, preparing them for workplaces that will monitor them even more intensively. The healthcare system presents another domain where observation has intensified beyond anything Foucault witnessed. Medical records that once existed in paper files accessible only with effort are now digitized, networked, potentially searchable by insurance companies, employers, government agencies. Genetic testing services promise insights into your ancestry and health risks while building databases of the most intimate biological information. Wearable devices track not just steps and heart rate, but sleep patterns, stress levels, menstrual cycles, mood variations. This health data, so personal and revealing, flows into systems whose purposes and security remain opaque to most users. There is a seductive promise in all this medical surveillance: earlier detection of diseases, more personalized treatment, better outcomes through data-driven medicine. And these promises are not entirely empty, but they come at a cost to privacy that is rarely fully disclosed. Your health data may be sold to pharmaceutical companies, used to train AI systems, analyzed for patterns that inform insurance pricing, shared with employers through wellness programs that are not as voluntary as they appear. The doctor-patient relationship, once characterized by confidentiality, increasingly involves third parties whose interests may not align with yours. Let us consider, too, the surveillance of public spaces that has accelerated in recent years. The proliferation of cameras is obvious enough. In major cities, the average person may be captured on video dozens of times a day as they move through streets, enter buildings, ride public transportation. Less obvious are the capabilities these cameras now possess. Facial recognition systems can match your face against databases of millions. Gait analysis can identify you by the distinctive way you walk, even if your face is hidden. License plate readers create logs of vehicle movements across entire metropolitan areas. Cell site location data tracks the movements of your phone, and therefore you, wherever you go. Some of this surveillance is governmental, deployed by police and security agencies in the name of public safety. Some is commercial, operated by businesses for marketing purposes or by private security firms protecting property. Some is individual, the doorbell cameras and dashboard cameras and nanny cameras that ordinary people have installed to watch their own domains. The result is a meshwork of overlapping observation, in which it has become genuinely difficult to move through public space without being recorded by someone. The effects of this ubiquitous visibility on public behavior are difficult to measure precisely, but likely significant. People may avoid certain places, certain associations, certain activities that might be recorded and judged. Protests may be deterred by the knowledge that facial recognition can identify participants. Intimate moments in public, a kiss, an argument, a moment of vulnerability, occur with awareness that cameras may be watching. The public sphere, which democratic theory imagines as a space of free assembly and free expression, becomes another site of performance and caution. There is wisdom in Foucault's observation that power produces resistance precisely because it operates through subjects rather than simply upon them. The same capacity for thought and judgment that makes us susceptible to internalize surveillance also equips us to recognize and question it. The growing awareness of surveillance, the increasing discourse about privacy and data rights, the development of counter-technologies and counter-practices, these are signs of a society grappling with the costs of visibility. Young people, in particular, are developing sophisticated responses to the surveillance environments in which they have grown up. They understand instinctively the difference between front stage and backstage, between public presentation and private life. They create elaborate systems of multiple accounts and varied personas to manage different audiences. They adopt technologies and practices that older generations find puzzling: temporary content that disappears, encrypted messages that leave no trace, deliberate obfuscation of their digital trails. These adaptations are not solutions to the problem of surveillance so much as strategies for living within it. They acknowledge the impossibility of escape while carving out niches of reduced visibility. They represent the kind of tactical resistance that Foucault saw as the typical response to power, not revolutionary overthrow, but everyday negotiation and subversion. There is also growing recognition that surveillance is not equally distributed. The watching eye falls more heavily on some than others. Those who live in poor neighborhoods face more police surveillance than those in wealthy ones. Those who belong to minority groups face more scrutiny than those who belong to majorities. Those who challenge authority face more observation than those who conform. The Panopticon may be universal in principle, but in practice it is yet another mechanism through which existing inequalities are reproduced and intensified. Foucault was deeply attentive to these differentials, to the way that disciplinary power operates through categories and classifications that sort populations into the normal and the deviant, the trustworthy and the suspicious, the compliant and the dangerous. Surveillance is not neutral observation, but active sorting, creating and reinforcing the very categories it claims merely to detect. As you prepare for sleep, these thoughts may seem heavy, even troubling. That is understandable. The recognition that we live within architectures of observation we did not choose and cannot easily escape is not comfortable knowledge. But there is also something liberating in understanding, something empowering in seeing clearly what before was obscure. The philosopher who does not know they are in a prison is less free than the one who knows and consciously chooses how to act within its constraints. Awareness does not undo the panopticon, but it creates a space of deliberation that unreflective conformity forecloses. You cannot choose your relationship to surveillance if you do not know that surveillance exists. You cannot practice resistance if you do not recognize what you are resisting. Tonight, as you lie in darkness, you occupy one of the few remaining spaces of relative privacy. The bedroom, with its door closed and lights extinguished, is a refuge from the visibility that characterizes so much of waking life. Sleep itself is perhaps the last domain that evades surveillance, the hours when consciousness ceases to perform, when the curated self dissolves into the mystery of dreams. Guard this space. Protect these hours. Resist the incursion of devices and screens and notifications into the time of rest. There is value in being unwatched, in having time that is truly your own, in maintaining a self that does not exist for the consumption of others. This is not paranoia, but wisdom, not technophobia, but the reasonable assertion of limits. The thinkers we have explored tonight, Bentham with his optimistic designs for rational reform, and Foucault with his troubling analysis of power's operation through visibility, both offer insights that illuminate our present moment. The panopticon that Bentham imagined and Foucault analyzed has been realized more comprehensively than either could have anticipated, not in stone and iron but in silicon and code, not through central towers but through distributed networks, not by guards in uniform but by algorithms that never sleep. And yet we remain human, with all the complexity and unpredictability and depth that implies. We are not merely objects to be observed and managed, data points to be analyzed and predicted, behaviors to be monitored and modified. We are subjects capable of reflection, of resistance, of relationships that cannot be reduced to surveillance logs. The panopticon may shape us, but it does not determine us entirely. Within its architecture, spaces of freedom persist. Let us consider what this means for the practice of daily life. There are choices we can make, habits we can cultivate, boundaries we can establish that create zones of reduced visibility without requiring complete withdrawal from the digital world. These are not revolutionary acts but practices of everyday resistance, small assertions of autonomy within systems designed to capture and direct our attention. Consider the simple act of leaving your phone in another room when you sleep. It seems like a small thing, almost trivial. But it creates a boundary, a space where the device's constant potential for connection and observation does not reach. Sleep becomes truly private, truly offline, truly free from the notifications and alerts that otherwise punctuate every hour. This small act of spatial separation is a practice of counter-conduct, a refusal to be available for surveillance and contact at all times. Consider the practice of taking walks without your phone, of spending time in nature or in neighborhoods where cameras are sparse, of creating pockets of untracked, unrecorded time in your weekly routine. These too are small acts, but they maintain capacities that constant connectivity erodes. The ability to be alone with your thoughts, to exist without documentation, to move through the world without creating a trail of data points that flow into systems beyond your knowledge or control. And consider the cultivation of relationships that exist primarily offline, friendships maintained through face-to-face conversation rather than social media interaction, communities that gather in physical spaces rather than virtual ones. These human connections, while they may leave fewer traces in digital systems, often prove deeper and more sustaining than the curated performances of online life. They represent an older form of social existence that surveillance cannot entirely capture. Consider too the simple practice of reading books. Physical books made of paper and ink that do not record which pages you linger on, do not know which passages you highlight, do not feed your reading habits into recommendation algorithms. There is a freedom in the printed page that electronic texts, for all their convenience, cannot match. The book asks nothing of you except attention. It reports nothing about you to anyone. It is a technology of one-way communication that respects, by its very limitations, the privacy of the reader. These practices may seem inadequate in the face of the comprehensive surveillance infrastructure we have described, and in a sense, they are. They do not dismantle the Panopticon or even significantly reduce its reach, but they preserve something valuable: the experience of being unobserved, the capacity for solitude and privacy that constant visibility erodes. They are exercises for a muscle that atrophies with disuse, the muscle of independent selfhood that does not depend on audience and performance. There is a deeper philosophical point here about the relationship between privacy and personhood. The self that develops under constant observation is a different kind of self than one that has access to solitude and hiddenness. The observed self is always partly performed, always shaped by awareness of how it appears to others. The unobserved self has space to explore, to experiment, to make mistakes without consequence, to develop in directions that do not need external validation. Children need unsupervised play to develop autonomy and creativity. Adults need private spaces to process difficult emotions, to think through controversial ideas, to maintain relationships whose intimacy depends on not being shared with the world. Societies need zones of privacy where dissent can germinate before facing public scrutiny. Privacy is not simply about hiding shameful secrets. It is about maintaining the conditions for authentic selfhood and genuine freedom. As you drift towards sleep tonight, you claim this privacy for yourself. For the next several hours, you will exist outside the economy of attention that dominates waking life. No one will be trying to capture your eyeballs, to redirect your clicks, to shape your preferences. Your consciousness will wander freely through dreams, following its own logic, serving no one's purposes but its own. This is not escape from the world, but temporary refuge, a nightly Sabbath from the demands of visibility. Thank you for joining me tonight on this journey through the philosophy of surveillance, from Bentham's unbuilt prison to Foucault's analysis of disciplinary power to the digital panopticon that surrounds us now. If these ideas have given you something to think about as you fall asleep, I hope you will consider liking this video and subscribing to the channel. Your support helps these philosophical explorations reach others who seek understanding in the quiet hours of the night. Please do let me know in the comments where in the world you are watching from. There is something beautiful about imagining this community of nighttime philosophers scattered across time zones, all drifting toward rest with the same thoughts settling softly in their minds. May your sleep tonight be peaceful and private, a temporary escape from the visibility that characterizes our waking hours. May you find in rest a space that belongs to you alone, unwatched and undocumented, and free. And may you wake tomorrow with just a little more awareness of the invisible architectures that shape our world, and just a little more resolve to protect those precious spaces where the watching eye cannot reach. Sweet dreams, fellow travelers. Until next time. As you drift off, remember that in these quiet hours you practice something precious and increasingly rare, the art of being unwatched, the discipline of disconnection, the freedom of sleep. The philosophers we have explored tonight would recognize in your rest a small but significant act of resistance against the demand for constant visibility. In choosing sleep, you choose yourself. May the morning find you refreshed, renewed, and perhaps just a little more aware of the world you will re-enter when you wake. The Panopticon will still be there with its cameras and algorithms and endless demands for attention, but you will face it having tasted, however briefly, what it means to exist without observation. That memory, that experience of privacy and solitude is itself a kind of freedom worth protecting. The conversation about surveillance and the self will continue. New technologies will emerge, new forms of observation and control will develop, new resistances will arise in response. Foucault's great insight was that this dialectic is endless, that power and resistance are locked in a dance that never concludes. We are not heading toward a final resolution, either utopia or dystopia, but navigating an ongoing negotiation between visibility and privacy, between connection and solitude, between the self that performs and the self that simply is. Your participation in that negotiation matters. The choices you make about technology, about privacy, about what you share and what you protect, contribute to the larger social conversation about what kind of surveillance society we are willing to accept. You are not merely a passive subject of the Panopticon, but an active participant in shaping its boundaries and limits. Rest now. Dream freely. And when you wake, carry with you some of what we have explored tonight. The watching eye will still be there, but so will your awareness of it, and that awareness is the beginning of freedom. Good night, dear friends. Sleep well.